my remarks last weekend, I was, as a Slavist, personally commemorating the 20th anniversary of the end of the Soviet Union, which started with a mismanaged putsch by the Communist Party conservatives and the KGB in Moscow, August 19th and 20th, 1991, and ended December 25th, 1991, with the disbanding of the Soviet Union. It was a time of uplifting, spontaneous, but peaceful, rhetorically adroit political action, grassroots organization, when ordinary citizens stood up to security forces and the military. But I remember one of the things that struck many of us was it was very narrowly limited to the center of Moscow. It didn't bring in a lot of people across the country. Ensuing events, the return to authoritarian rule and so forth, has led me to ask many, many times, what does it all mean? To start with, what did the world look like 20 years ago? And we've just heard two people's impressions. So I'll just add mine to the mix, and we'll all add ours to over the next 3 days. The Cold War and the arms race were still on, though seemingly on the wane. The breakdown of the Cold War world order, in which the US and the USSR were the leaders, was really readily apparent. The Soviet-Afghan War, the US-Iranian hostage crisis were still fresh in our minds. The world was vastly more Eurocentric than it appears to be now. The world was divided into first world countries, the rich capitalist democracies, second world Soviet bloc countries, which were centralized socialist dictatorships with centralized command economies, and third world countries with state borders created largely by European colonial powers, mainly perhaps post-colonial military and other dictatorships. The world was already breaking up. The Eastern Bloc had split off from the Soviet Union, and local conflicts were breaking out around the edges of the Soviet Empire. Several countries in the African world were fragmenting into civil war. We think of Somalia, Rwanda, Liberia, Sierra Leone, and eventually the Rwandan genocide. This horror was happening at the same time as other societies were experiencing moments of jubilation. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela was released, and apartheid gradually came to an end. Across Latin America, military dictatorships were falling, and many countries were moving toward free elections and market economies. While the Cold War had a great impact on East Asia, the end of the Cold War in the late 80s and early 90s really wasn't so important, my colleagues tell me, as it seems to us in the West. The Koreas remained divided, but post-Tiananmen Square China was on its way to becoming a blended, nominally communist authoritarian government with private capitalist enterprise, and starting to feel the heat of international attention on its own internal ethnic and civil problems, something that's really pretty new, it seems like, for China. This is from a non-specialist. The other BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia eventually, India, and then of course China, had not yet started to become the economic powerhouses they are today, but they were on their way. Globalization was only kind of a twinkle in the eyes of perhaps School of Business professors and multinational companies. Wars over resources were starting. Among others, we think of the Persian Gulf War, 1990-1991. Fundamentalist religion was making a political comeback in Islamic, Christian, and Jewish worlds already for a decade before. We used snail mail and landlines to communicate. Basically, no one knew what text messaging was, and certainly no one was thinking about political overthrows and revolutions that could be put into action through tweeting and messaging and so forth. Anybody here remember how big and clunky those original cell phones were? You couldn't fit them in your pocket. Questions we can think about over the next 3 days that I'll add to what's already been said. How do we make sense of these quite stormy 20 years that we've just been through. What is the narrative? Is there a unifying narrative, or is the narrative fragmented according to region or according to local experience? Strangely, some political scientists, like Francis Fukuyama, started talking about the end of history back in 1990. What did that mean? Have we witnessed the end of those grand ideologies, at least for the moment? Have the great Enlightenment ideals of liberty, fraternity, and equality lost their holds on our imagination? I want to say no with my whole being, but I wonder. How do we map identity and community in today's world? Do we map or do we code, as some political scientists do? Are ideas of identity and community linked to some great temporal idea of time forward, of progress? Or are we hearing narratives of taking our original communities back, of going in some sense backwards? Has our concept of time become little more than a Mobius strip, seeming to move forward, only eventually to come back to the starting point, or something like it? Is this a time of revolution? Is it a time of a break with the past? Is it evolutionary, or is it circular in some sense? How are ideas of identity and community linked to images of space? How can those be mapped? How do they relate to national or state borders, linguistic borders, economic borders? So this conference is attempting the seemingly impossible. We've brought you together area and international studies experts from the most diverse world areas and disciplines to ask what the concepts of identity and community mean in your world areas and your academic communities themselves. The danger is always that people will pay attention to talks only pertaining to their world area and discipline. The challenge for all of us is to broaden our horizons. Instead of thinking that we are comparing and contrasting apples and oranges, to quote my big fat Greek wedding, I hope that we will see the ways in which our various areas are all fruit. And I hope we will enjoy a fruitful 3 days in which we learn from each other, learn each other's vocabularies, and use the questions that various of us raise to think in new ways about our own areas of expertise and how they fit in today's world. Thanks so much, and welcome.